Yeah, it's good to be here with you. I enjoyed listening to the first part of this as well. Neat what you're doing.
Great, great. Well, let me give folks a little background, and I'm going to ask you to share a bit about yourself. And we'll try to keep the video on because it's nice since we're having a conversation. But if we get a bit frozen up, we might have to pause it. That sometimes can be a thing. So, folks in the class, do let us know if that becomes a barrier to you hearing us well. So, I just want to say, from my experience, I stumbled across Fred's work really in researching the silvopasture book, and it kind of whacked me over the head like a ton of bricks because it felt like kind of felt like similar to when I took my first chainsaw safety class and realized that I'd been running a chainsaw for 10 years without safety gear and without very much knowledge. Someone just handed me the tool and I kind of winged it, and I felt like I got out of that class and realized, I should have I probably should have hurt myself a lot worse. I was really lucky to to have made it to where I was at that point in life. And so I feel similar about this information because having raised animals for 10 or 12 years, and I think being raised, I would argue, in a culture or a context within farming that's often seen the animals as subordinate or sort of unintelligent, right? Leads us to sort of, I think, perpetuate some patterns of dominion over them. And so there's a piece that my wife and I always felt like about the way we loved our animals and also kind of managed and made all these decisions about their lives that is one layer to this. But then there's just this fact of not really understanding what they needed to be well, truly, which to me is this this buffet of choice out in their daily experience of pasture. So Fred's work has been just really inspiring for me to just see our landscape and see the things growing on it in a very different way. And then as we dig into some of the sort of persistent challenges we have as livestock producers. So, with sheep, it's always the parasites and this being a problem. Well, it seems like rotational grazing and some choices about foods and sort of targeting some specific foods can really offer a lot as a way to allow the animals to heal themselves. In the same way that we're, as we learn more how to be human, we're gaining more of our medicinal things from the landscape and seeing the effects of that, of course. So it's been really great. I tried to do justice to Fred's 40 years of work in a few pages of the book, which he was gracious to let me sort of summarize. And so we're really happy to have you here. And I have some questions and some ways to frame it. I know we have some pictures to show, but of course, anyone in the class that has a question that comes up, please do enter it in the chat, and we'll make sure to answer that and take the conversation where everybody wants it to go. So that's a little bit about where I'm coming from with this conversation. I'd love for you to share where you're coming from, your background, and how you came to this work.
Well, first I'll say, Steve, it's wonderful to be on the program with all of you folks, and very much appreciate what you did in the book that you wrote relative to summarizing the work that we've done over 40 years. Yes, for me, it all started in the mountains of Colorado, where I was born and raised, and was always interested in wild creatures. Um, I wasn't born and raised on a ranch, but when I was in high school, I started working on a ranch. We had cattle, sheep, a few goats, a few ducks and geese, and kind of the menagerie of things. But that along with doing an undergraduate degree in wildlife biology at that same time just hugely piqued my interest in all the topics that you were alluding to. And the world of plants and plant diversity just absolutely fascinated me. Food selection, habitat selection by animals fascinated me as well. And so that's really where my interest came from. And working with the old rancher, Henry DeLuca was his name, and learned so much over those 7 years I was on the ranch with Henry about, he had no formal education. His knowledge came to his brain through his hands, through just working out there, but he knew so much. And we used to talk about what does it mean for an animal to know the range? And he, without going into details, there were reasons I was really curious about that from what I was learning at school. he would sit down and tell me of his experiences. And when I think back over the years, what we've done, I think all of the work really has to do with that question that Henry used to talk about. What's it mean for an animal to know the range? And that led us into all these things that I think you'll ask questions about. But, you know, as you said, I forever a student of this stuff, I think, you know. You're learning all the time about
Mm.
these things, and like your chainsaw class and all the rest, I think always the way, huh?
Yeah, yeah, great. Yeah, so I think the way I like to start these is just to put some terms out there because we'll probably mention them several times and we can just kind of define those if that works for you.
Yes.
So can you describe palatability and how that is often thought of or defined and how you want to talk about palatability?
You know, I think how palatability historically was viewed as taste and liking. We consider something that you liked as palatable, that a creature didn't like, including us, as unpalatable. And that's certainly true. Taste and smell really are critical, not only for humans, but for goats, sheep, cattle, I'm sure for ducks and geese and all the creatures. It's the experience of that. I think what our work really did, and this opened my eyes to a world I never knew, um, was to show that liking for food is a function of feedback, these metabolic feedbacks. And the feedbacks are being chemically mediated through these so-called, more definitions, primary compounds, which we think of as energy, protein, and minerals, and then this whole host of secondary compounds, the alkaloids, the terpenes, the phenolics. At a cellular level, you know, that's cells are foraging on those compounds to maintain their health. And they're feeding back the cells and organ systems, including the microbiome, to alter liking for food as a function of need. Does that make sense?
It
It's
does,
these
yeah.
feedbacks, and it's, you know, because you think, where's food go? Ultimately, it ends up at cellular level through capillaries, and those cells can only forage on what's in those capillaries. Feedback is a way for them to influence, and it happens in amazing ways with different organ systems. The brain has this needs, the liver has that needs, the muscles and so forth, and they're all playing a role in terms of what animals select. It gets incredibly complex, but I think that's where we went with this whole idea, and just for 30 years did all kinds of studies to that were basically showing again and again and again that feedback was so important in terms of altering liking as a function of what the animals actually needed.
That's great. So it's this idea, I guess we could compare and contrast a little bit. This idea of the animals having a feedback mechanism operating on multiple levels and in different ways that's based on some combination of primary and secondary compounds in food, right? Is they're getting that
Absolutely.
information based on some combination of those things.
Absolutely.
And so how would we compare that experience of getting that feedback in a landscape to my favorite thing to bring up, which is the opposite of that, I think, which is the total mixed ration, or the TMR, the idea that with both livestock and now to people, we could actually predetermine and formulate those combinations and sort of meet what is the ultimate or the optimum, you know, diet, right? And in agriculture, that's because that should optimize performance, meaning weight gained or milk produced or something like that, right? So
Yeah.
let's talk about the difference between this idea of flavor feedback and these compounds versus the idea that we can develop this total mixed ration, if that makes sense.
To give credit and to go back historically, you know, if you read the literature in animal science and animal nutrition, it's incredibly interesting to trace the development of, you know, as you move from animals on landscapes where there's a diverse array of plants available, to taking total control for the ration that you're going to feed animals. When you read historically, it really helps a person to understand the evolution of understanding in nutrition. People had to really come to understand all that animals need: energy, protein, minerals, vitamins. And it's a very interesting history. And so that knowledge was gained one chink at a time about how do you, if you're going to take pigs, for instance, and you're going to formulate a ration for them, or cows or whatever it is, how do you do that in ways that really meets needs? So I give a ton of credit to nutritionists for really working their way through and coming to understand better, what are the needs of animals, and how, if you are taking that under your control, how do you do that? So a tremendous amount has been learned, and I give total credit for that. I think, to say a word in the other direction then, um, the more we restrict what animals have available to them, for instance, from a really diverse landscapes like I spent most of my career working in, where there'd be 50, 75, 100, 200, 300 different species of plants that they could forage from, going from that, say, to a very limited number, to a monoculture on a pasture where there's only one plant that perhaps is very, very good in terms of its energy and protein content, but very, very limited in terms of all these secondary compounds. And then to go to that, from that to the total mixed ration, we're simply restricting more and more of the options that animals have in order to maintain total health. And so I think to make up for that, under feedlot conditions, there are really a lot of health issues with that, and the amount of antibiotics that need to be provided to animals and so forth. And in diverse swards, with animals that have experience utilizing those swards, they're able to meet their needs not only for nutrients, but for medicines as well. I think that those landscapes become nutrition centers and pharmacies, basically. I'll interject a thing right here. I'm working with a person in Botswana right now, and he contacted me a couple of years ago. Their interest there, he and the ecologists, are in wild animal populations and how they use different resources in those landscapes, those wildlife, in order to maintain the health of their populations. And now with increasing numbers of people, how the animals are becoming more and more restricted in terms of the options available to them. But one of the neat things I think about this paper, I think it's the reason he wanted me to join him on the paper, is we've always focused in wildlife ecology on energy, protein, and minerals. And the secondary compounds has been viewed strictly as feeding deterrents. And what he wants, a key point he wants to make in this paper, is we need to totally rethink that. These secondary compounds in modest amounts bring huge health benefits to animals in terms of internal parasites, boosting immune response, and so forth and so on. So it's kind of interesting to see the wildlife folks circling back and saying, we viewed these as deterrents, and certainly they play a role in that, but in the right amounts and with a diverse array of those, we've missed the boat. They're really important for health. So that's kind of winding around to the total mixed ration and, different views. And I give credit across the board, but I think that diversity of different plant species, and then, a topic that I'm quite interested in nowadays and working with people in the ARS and at Duke University, is how the diet that the animals ingest and the diversity of that diet scales up to influence the composition of meat and fat of the animal, and then the quality of the diet for us, inflammatory responses when it gets into our body. And there's some remarkable leads there. Our colleague at Duke, Stefan van Vliet, has just completed a metabolomics analysis of faux meat versus meat that's coming from really phytochemically rich landscapes. And they couldn't be more different. They could not be more different. We just submitted that to JAMA. So I think it scales up, this whole, what the animals are being exposed to is influencing their nutrition and health. But then I see that as scaling up to influence our nutrition and health as well.
So letting my sheep eat some willow here and there might be good for me, is what you're saying, potentially.
Right. That's the idea behind it.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
totally the idea behind that.
Do you wanna share a few slides? It seems like we want to maybe get a few examples and some stories about how some of this work came about. I'm looking at some of the things about the goats eating twigs of blackbrush and wood rat houses, and I'm really curious about that. So do you have
So
those slides up, or do you want me to share them
I
for
do
you?
have, either way.
Why don't you just go ahead and share, because then you can move them
What
if
do
you
I
want to.
hit here then, Steve? I'm a need share screen.
You should just hit share screen, and then it'll ask you to pick your program that the slides are in, and then it'll just share them with the rest of us. Yeah.
Okay. Is that there?
Yeah, that's there. Yeah, and if you just play it like you would a slideshow, you can see it, or you can just kind of toggle the screen. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter to us.
Okay.
Yeah, great. Tell us about this.
So the blackbrush story. I was fresh off the ranch in those days and starting grad school as a master's student, really interested in food selection. If I'd had my choice, I'd have been studying mountain goats in the mountains of Colorado, but I ended up studying domestic goats down in southern Utah. And the idea was historically goats had been used as mobile pruning machines to prune blackbrush during the winter to increase the quality of food for cattle. And this may look strange to you, these cows here, but it shows the flexibility and the ability of animals when, depending upon what's selected for. So there's a genetic component, but also, and this body size is really critical here, not huge animals, but also what those animals have learned to do. Cattle make their living on blackbrush dominated ranges during the winter time. That's where they wintered, those animals. And they knew that, if you prune the shrub, it stimulates this new growth. This that I'm pointing to is a shrub was browsed the previous winter, all kinds of new growth on it. And so the idea was we knew that new growth was higher in energy and protein and minerals, and we thought that the goats would really prefer that to the old woody growth, but they didn't. They didn't prefer that at all. They strongly, most of them, let me make that point, 80% of them strongly preferred the old growth to the new growth. Another 20% preferred the new growth to the old growth. So we were really surprised at that. Another thing we found was that goats, we had 6 pastures set up down there this first year, and we had Angora goats on there. And the goats in this pasture right here that I'm looking at started to eat these wood rat houses. And, blackbrush doesn't look great, but woodland houses look even worse. So those two things really perked my interest. Well, why are the goats avoiding the current season's growth? Why are they eating wood rat houses in this particular case? And when I went back to campus and visited with some of the folks I was working with on my committee, nutritionists and toxicologists, I was telling them the story, and their basic response was, well, I guess that just goes to show that domestic animals lack nutritional wisdom. And that was really the belief at the time, was that wild animals still obviously must have nutritional wisdom. They have to make a living for themselves, but as a result of 10,000 years of domestication, as well as us starting to take control of the diets of animals, they had lost this nutritional wisdom. So that really set me to thinking about and studying what we did for the next 30 years. And I think it's really critical to make the point that nutritional wisdom, there are 3 facets, at least 3 facets we studied that really are critical to this. One is what you and I had talked about, these flavor feedback relationships, metabolically mediated relationships. The second, and you talked about that, Steve, as you were in the first part of the lecture today, the availability of alternatives is critical. As we restrict animals more and more and more, their ability to meet their needs becomes ever more restrictive, not only for primary compounds, but for the secondary compounds as well. And then there's a third part. that I think is so critical, these whole social cultural linkages to landscapes that really begin in utero and early in life. You know, what mother's eating, uh, we know this from the work we did with cattle, sheep, and goats. The flavors of those foods get into the amniotic fluid. So the young fetus, the fetal taste system's fully functional during the last trimester of gestation. So the young animal actually begins to learn what food is very early in life, basically. So, you know, I see these as three legs to the stool of nutritional wisdom. If we break any one of those legs, um, not going to have nutritional wisdom manifest. If all three legs are broken, as we've done, I think, sometimes with domestic animals, and certainly in the diets that we humans now are exposed to, then it really, there's no way for nutritional wisdom to be manifest.
So a question I have is how does how does this stool then relate to long term if we're I guess rebuilding the stool in some fashion? How does that relate to what you started off talking about with sort of the relationship an animal then builds with a particular landscape? Where do you see the relationship of those two things?
You know, I think they go hand in hand for certain. And you know, let me tell you a story from when I was on the ranch. I was taking classes in animal science at Colorado State University as part of the wildlife biology program. I was interested in that, taking classes on genetics and feeding and those kind of things, and got me to thinking about the way Henry managed animals on his ranch. He never brought in animals from outside the ranch. He kept his own replacement heifers. He had a strategy for how he would bring in bulls that I've thought about quite a lot since our years of working with this. But he always kept his own replacement heifers. And I remember asking him one time, Henry, why do you do that? Why don't you bring in you know, he liked Herefords. Okay, so bring in Herefords from other sources and try to get these heterosis effects that people were talking about. That's when he sat down and started to tell stories. He said, you know, how we manage the animals here on the ranch. You've been here a few years now. He said, in the spring of the year, we start to move seasonally. We move up onto BLM land. And then as we go into summer, we move up onto Forest Service land. We have the animals moving across these really large landscapes at elevations anywhere from 9,500 to 11,000 feet. And he said, you know how when we go to move animals from pasture to pasture, we're going to find a little group over here in you know, in Droney, a little group over here in Weldon, all these things that I had been observing. They aren't just there in one big herd. When they put them up there, they separate into their small group formations. And we know where to find them, and then we move them to the next place. He says, if you bring animals that don't know the range into here, you don't know if you'll find them or where you'll find them. Odds are they're not going to be reproduce nearly as well as the animals that are here. And so he'd tell me stories like that. He told me also a story of a time when, for reasons I don't need to get into, they lost their grazing permit. The permit was suspended for a couple of years, and they had to put their animals in a different part on a whole new range. He said it was the summer from hell. It was the summer from hell. And he summed the whole thing up by saying that the animals just don't know the range. What's it mean to know the range? It's these linkages, these transgenerational linkages that have to do with knowing what and what not to eat, where and where not to go, what's a predator, what's not a predator. We know that all these things are learned, and moreover, that they influence gene expression starting in utero. And so we showed in many studies, and I have some slides if you want to look at that briefly, that these experiences influence the development of organ systems. They influence the ability of animals to utilize foods that are in the local landscape. And all that's taking place generation to generation to generation. And that's what's, of course, what's occurring in wildlife populations. But the analog would be from a domestic animal standpoint, when you have animals that know the range, you have all kinds of adaptations occurring that wouldn't dawn on us if we think simply as animals as machines and genes as destiny. If we think of genes being expressed and influencing form and function, and then that in being interacting with behavior, then you have this dynamic that allows animals to become locally adapted to the environments where they're born and raised and live over many generations.
So do you have a sense, if we were to talk to a farmer who's just getting started with livestock, is there a sense of like how many years you might it might take to expect to see that relationship forming? Like, is there a point when it becomes significant, or is it every year we're just going to see an increase in that if the same herd is, or the same group is moving through the same landscape? And I know you may not have the exact answer to that, but maybe some.
No, but that's right. You know, animals learn quickly. There's no question. Young animals learn very, very quickly. And when you think of these mother-young interactions and how that happens, it was amazing to me see over the years that, of course, as I'm saying, starting in utero, through mother's milk, experiences with watching mother, young animals are certainly learning what and what not to eat and where not to go. But young animals are also creating as a part of that system. They're sampling new foods, and mothers can learn from offspring. We got involved in a silvopasture pasture deal actually years ago. It was with grazing in pine plantations where it was absolutely clear that the young were training the mothers to actually to eat the trees, which wasn't a good thing. But that's another story. But to your question, they learn quickly, and so you put animals in a landscape, and they're starting to learn about that landscape, and then as you go from one generation to the next, it's not that it takes forever for these kind of things to occur. Right off the bat. I think what's interested me the most, and it goes back to that woodrat house example. There were 6 groups of goats on 6 different pastures during the year, during that first year of the study. But only one group of goats started to eat woodrat houses. And you think, well, so why were they doing that? It wasn't just a foolish thing that happened. Let's look back. So these woodrat houses are covered in bark from the juniper trees. But when you strip that bark away, you see densely packed vegetation with different rooms in it, basically. And one of those rooms is the bathroom, and it's soaked in urine and feces. That's what the goats were going for. And what it became was a non-protein nitrogen supplement. And this group of goats fared far better over the 3 months that they were browsing on blackbrush than the other 5 groups of goats. Now, my wife and I were living with those goats, and we didn't see the minute that the first goat started to really go after that, but we saw the day that it was occurring. And however that got started, that became really a functional behavior for that group of goats. And they would have passed that on to their offspring. The thing that was curious to me is that none of the other 5 groups of goats figured that out. And then over the next 3 winters, with 18 different groups of goats, none of them did that. That's what's become so interesting to me, Steve, and I can give you other examples. Sheep at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station that learn that an appetizer of bitterbrush helps them to eat more sagebrush. That's a learned behavior. And so, I think that's what gets interesting is these, what would you say, fluky kind of things, these outlier kind of things that become very significant. And that's, I think, what becomes, I think of the African elephants and some of the, they live in matriarchies, And the old matriarchs that really have learned, they'll live, what, 60, 70, 80 years, that have learned, when we get into this situation, this is what we do, and so forth. That becomes a huge knowledge that gets built into those groups of animals. And then to realize, as the French shepherds do, if we think, let's blast forward here a second to these shepherds, with their grazing circuits, they're learning from the animals, and this is goat, sheep, and cattle, all three. They're learning from the animals, and then they're using that as a way to train the animals. It's a mutual kind of student-teacher relationship. And they learn that the ways that animals learn to mix their diets influences their ability to utilize the landscape. And so as you look across this landscape here, you have everything from first rate that we might think, well, that's really a place we want to spend most of our time and very appreciable. But what they figured out is that through the meal courses and sequences, they can have animals utilizing every bit of that landscape in ways that benefit the landscape by maintaining the diversity of plants in that landscape, which they know and deliberately do in terms of conservation measures, but it's also enhancing the productivity of the animals themselves. My good friend, Michel Mireille, who took the lead role on this Art and Science of Shepherding, has worked with shepherds for 40 years now. I said when he first started, he was absolutely blown away by the levels of productivity of those animals and the behavioral nuance that came about between the relationship between the shepherd and the sheep. And these grazing circuits that they create enable individuals to regulate their intake of primary and secondary compounds. And I want to go back to a point that you made that's a good one relative to the TMR. The TMR is formulated for the average individual. And the challenge that animal scientists will never be able to overcome is that there is no average individual. Every individual is absolutely unique. And so you can formulate a ration that certainly is meant for the average individual. But when we've done studies with sheep and cattle where we give animals a choice of the ingredients in the TMR versus feeding animals the TMR, we actually find that one, when they're given choice, no two individuals ever select the same combination of foods. They never select the same food from day to day. They actually eat less food because they're not having to over-ingest to, say, meet needs for protein in a ration that's locked in for a certain animal. And so this individuality is really, it's absolutely critical to realize that for the animals that we work with. And when you move animals across landscapes, it enables them to meet their own needs. That can stimulate appetite and intake for a variety of foods. And then they use that as a way to target grazing to enhance and maintain biodiversity. So, I think, and I don't say this to say, so everybody should be a shepherd or whatever. I say it to say that this is the potential, this is the possibilities. And, they're virtually, they're endless. But going back to where your question and where I'd started. So these animals, the goats learn to eat a wood rat house, or some sheep learn that an appetizer of bitterbrush helps them to eat more sagebrush, which is really functionally significant for them and for the landscape. These are all things that shepherds think about, and they think about, well, how can we set this up? How can we train animals to mix diets in different ways? How through our grazing management? How through the sequences? So I say this simply as ways to think, you look at your landscape and you think, well, animals don't eat this and animals do eat that. And certainly that can be true, but sagebrush in the Great Basin's enormous. And you think, well, animals don't like it much. Well, sheep that learn to eat bitterbrush first think sagebrush is, they can eat a lot more sagebrush. So throw this out as to think about possibilities.
So let me ask you this then. If we're sort of talking on the broad, range scale, if we took this concept in a different direction, are there ways that you've seen or you can imagine utilizing the information when you think about situations where animals are more in confinement, but they have, a different combination of different feed inputs? Is there a way that a farmer would present those that would be potentially more in line with the kind of research that you're talking about versus mixing it all together in this sort of averaging?
Um, Certainly, Steve. Certainly. Let me make sure that I'm understanding. So, if there are different feeds that are possible to offer to an animal, and rather than kind of grinding them, mixing them all together, the
Yeah.
possibility then of offering those different things, free choice, huh?
Yeah, so like our ducks were feeding them this pelletized mixture, right? That's sort of pre-formulated at the mill, and it has some corn, and it has some of this, and it has some of that, and that's all listed on the side. So, my question is around sort of the effect of, you know, let's say breaking that apart, taking those parts and feeding them out almost separately, versus continuing with that mixture, right? Would there be potentially a difference with that?
Yes, I would certainly say so, based on not just what I think, but the studies we did with sheep, where we did that, the studies with cattle, the studies with bison. We worked with some of quite a lot with Ted Turner's land managers and their bison feeding operations, and we were looking at feeding them in different ways to finish bison. They were very interested in that. And one of the things that we were looking at was giving them choices as opposed to simply restricting their intake. And in all those cases, you really allow individuals to meet their needs. That of course requires you to think about, well, how do you offer the food? What are the ways that you
Right.
would do that, and so forth and so on, the logistics of doing that.
Mm-hmm.
But when we did that, I think of the cattle study we did. We had them on finishing ration. It was the last 2-3 months of their life. We're monitoring intake every day. One group was offered the ingredients, just as you're saying. In this case, it was alfalfa, barley, corn silage. The other group had that as a total mixed ration. We measured intake for every animal of every food throughout that finishing period. We looked at how much food they ate. We looked then at carcass characteristics, at feed efficiency, and the animals that were offered a choice ate less food throughout that finishing trial. So the cost for feed was less. There's a greater labor cost because we just set up bunks uh, so that we could offer the foods and have the animals able to select those. But
So there is a potential for that, like
yes,
actually having less feed overall, because I think, as you said before, the animals aren't overeating to compensate for seeking out some kind of particular nutrient or some particular protein or something like that to balance themselves out, right? So
yes,
in that way, they can kind of self-direct that a bit and might actually save the volume of feed overall.
yes, that's
Do you have
absolutely what we
yeah,
found.
yeah. Great. Do you have a sense? Sean has a question. It's something I imagine others are thinking of, and I'm thinking of, is if there's what the differences are that you experience. I know you worked mostly with ruminants, but when we look at ruminants versus maybe pigs or poultry, if you have any thoughts about differences in maybe those two main groups, and then it'd be interesting if there's any differences within even the ruminants that you might want to touch on, or is it sort of a broad pattern that we could sort of say across the board is
Uh,
there?
I think this notion of individuality is absolutely solid. There's a book that was written years ago titled Biochemical Individuality. And it's a remarkable book that Roger Williams wrote. He was looking at an array of different creatures. He was mainly interested in humans, but this notion that no two individuals have ever been the same on this planet is so solid. And as Williams pointed out back then, he said, he was thinking so far ahead. He published this back in the 50s. He was thinking what this means is that that there is a wisdom to the body, that it allows each individual to meet its own needs. So there's really, in a way, he was saying no need for nutrition. You just have to offer decent choices, and the body will figure that out. So I think that relates whether you're talking about a pig or a chicken or whatever it is, that notion that no two individuals are alike, and when they're given options, they're able to meet their needs within the days, across days, and if those options contain a rich array of phytochemicals as well, I think that those are so important for bolstering the health of the animals. And then, not to sound like a broken record, but what's in that, the milk, the cheese, the meat that we eat, that's all scaling up to influence what we're actually eating as well. So,
Yeah.
I think at that level, and then certainly, a chicken isn't a pig, isn't a sheep, isn't a goat. So,
Sure. Sure.
as you guys know so well, their digestive systems are different, and what they, what they can thrive on is different.
Right. Right. So
But they certainly eat a variety of different foods, all of them.
So I guess then a follow-up question to that is, because we've talked about learning and individual and group learning and learning from mother and offspring and all these different things. What is the what does it look like, and sort of what are the differences if I offered an animal a whole buffet of choices? This is an animal that's never lived in that kind of environment. And I think about this in relationship to toxicity on the landscape, that sometimes an animal, right, can overeat something if they're not familiar with it, and it can have a problematic effect. And so I'm curious about this idea of familiarity, right, and how that's so. And I guess the prescription, I think, for our group here is, what are the ways that we might take animals who are used to a more, average mixed diet? How do we start to diversify that diet and not run into problems with, too much too fast or something like that? Does that make sense?
And it's such an important question that you ask, whether it's plants in the environment that they may not know, or I'm thinking of the study I was just saying with the cattle and with the sheep as well, where we offered them free choice, corn, barley, corn silage, alfalfa, and the initial response from nutritionists is, the animals are going to get sick. They're going to over-ingest the grain and they're going to get sick. And we knew that could certainly be the case, especially if animals have had just a little bit of grain and they learn that it's really a good thing, and then you give them free access to it. But the way we prevented that was to have them on the corn silage and the alfalfa, just as a for instance. We started them on that as the base ration, and we very gradually increased the amount of grain that we were offering each day. And we never had problems with animals over ingesting in that case. I remember studies we did with sheep where we would offer them a choice of alfalfa and barley. And it's so illustrated. We had 24 animals on this trial, and you had everywhere from animals that wanted hardly any grain at all, and almost all alfalfa, right across the board. The animals just loved the grain, didn't want hardly any alfalfa. So that individuality was being expressed, but also we didn't have sick animals because they were each regulating their intake of those feeds as a function of what their body could actually deal with. So, I think there certainly in that case, that was the way. We knew that animals could get sick, so we were really careful in that study with how we got them onto the ration. On rangelands, I think a lot. I've thought a lot about that, and I worked, spent my career working with people at the Poisonous Plants Research Lab in Logan. And when you have animals that are familiar with the landscape, the likelihood of them being poisoned is far less than animals, as you're pointing out, that are absolutely naive to a landscape. In one way or another, the animals need to gain some experience with that. One of the ways that the French shepherds use when they're when they take naive animals up to these broad landscapes, is to put them in with experienced animals and let them gradually learn. They have sequence of steps that they take where they let them gradually learn. And who's teaching them? It's the knowledgeable animals. They're watching them. I think my wife and I lived in a place called South Park for 7 years after I retired, and they used to put stalker cattle on those landscapes, and they did poorly, very, very, very poorly up there, even though there's huge diversity of different plant species and so forth. And I think the problem was just what you're pointing out. They bring these stalkers from all over the country. They haven't a clue of the landscapes, these mountainous landscapes that they're in, what's necessarily food and what's not, where to go, where not to go, all the predators that are up there, and they just look freaked out. One of the ways I think, to have helped with that situation would be to take some cows, some old mature cows that know that country, and use them to help guide those stalkers to do the kind of behaviors that you wanted to do. Let them have the chance to learn from an experienced animal that actually does the behaviors that you want in the landscape.
Hmm.
And that's what the shepherds are really doing over there in France when they have naive animals as well.
Yeah, yeah. A couple questions I'm going to share from folks. Just a question from Sean. He says he has goats who don't drink any water. Is that unusual? Are they getting their water from brush? I guess hydration and water plays a role in this. So I'm curious about that piece, and specifically his question there about his goats not really drinking any water.
Yeah. Oh, it's a good question. I'm guessing that he has water available, free choice for them. So I would guess that they're getting it from the forages that they're ingesting would be the first thing that comes to my mind. Certainly, as you're alluding to, there's an important relationship between quality water and food intake. Without adequate water, a lot of issues come up. But that's the first thing would come to my mind. If they've got access to good, clean water, that there's no problems with the water, then they're probably getting the water from the forages.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I'll encourage folks in the class, keep asking questions, or if you have specifics you're thinking about that you want to have Fred address, then you can put them right in the chat box. I want to talk just a little bit, maybe drill in a little bit, and maybe like slide 12 would be good to look at. I want to just drill in and talk a little more about secondary compounds. And I'm particularly interested in any specifics around them, like what we know generally and what specifics might show up. So for instance, I'm really fascinated with observing my sheep consume willow and the sort of benefits, the potential benefits of the tannins in willow. And so I'm always curious to take these conversations from sort of, wow, this is an amazing phenomenon, to how does one start to utilize that in their landscape? Well, like, what are some take-home messages for that, right? So, so I'd love to talk a little more about secondary compounds, some of the nuances in there, and maybe ways that they can be, prescribed on the landscape, or that the animals can come into contact with those from a manager's perspective.
Yeah, if we start with tannins, since you mentioned that, Steve, just as an example, I talked about the blackbrush, of course, and the new twigs in blackbrush. The reason the goats didn't want to eat those twigs is they're so incredibly high in tannins. And it's a particular kind of condensed tannin that is really deterrent to 80% of the goats. Another 20% don't have any problems with it. They can utilize that. But so, when we were studying that and writing about that and publishing it in science journals, that fits so nicely with what ecologists were finding out about secondary compounds as feeding deterrents for animals. And certainly in high concentrations, they do deter animals from eating forages. But in modest amounts, let's take tannins as for instance, we know that tannins bind with proteins in the rumen. And what that leads to is what ruminant nutritionists refer to as a bypass effect. They bind to high quality protein in the rumen, so the microbes can't degrade it there. That protein is passed down to the small intestine, and the tannins and the protein dissociate there. And so that gets high quality protein down to the small intestine to be absorbed. Whether those details make sense or not doesn't matter. It's well established. The key point is that boosts protein nutrition in animals. So that's a role that tannins can play. So much research has been done in the last, 20 years or so to show that tannins can have adverse effects on internal parasites, and terpenes can as well. And so I think that's, this whole idea of these compounds and the roles they play has really, this idea of self-medication, tannins, terpenes, alkaloids for internal parasites, compounds that can be functional for external parasites. All these things play important roles. If you think about self-medication, there's two ways really that animals can self-medicate. One, we've been talking about, that's therapeutically. The animal gets sick and it learns that a certain plant in the environment can help it to feel better. And certainly there's good evidence to show that that's the case. But I often think back to all the studies that I was involved in early on in my career, and studies that were published where on these diverse landscapes, animals will eat maybe 50, 75 plants in a meal, just a bite here, a nibble there. And I used to discount those, and I know other people did as well. Okay, they're part of the diet, but it's really 3 to 5 to 7 that make up the bulk of the diet. Anymore, I don't think that. I think it's not only the 3 to 5, but it's those 50 to 75 that are providing all those different kind of secondary compounds that really help animals to enhance their health. So, and the huge books have been written on secondary compounds in plants and their potential toxic roles in ruminants and so forth, or in other animal species. More and more for me, there was a time in my career I was really doing a lot of work with natural products chemists. We were, identifying these different compounds and on and on and on. But as I've aged, I worry less and less about, what plant, I know a lot of that, what plants contain different compounds, but I think, that's probably, in one sense, it's important, but in another sense, it's the diversity, and just allowing animals to eat a diversity of these different plants, and just realizing that they're all going to have different kinds and amounts of secondary compounds, and that simply animals having the ability to utilize a broad array of those is what's really engendering health, without having to worry about the particulars of the 30, 40, 50 different compounds that species X might have, and comparing that with species Y and species Z. I don't know if that makes sense, but the levels of complexity become enormous when you start to think about, an animal eats a meal of 50 plants, each with 100 different compounds. You're dealing with tens of thousands of these compounds introduced into the body. To me, it becomes amazing then to think at a cellular level, the cells know what they need if they're provided with decent alternatives.
Yeah, that's great. And we're having a little bit of that. I really appreciate that as a prescription. I think sometimes people want this very specific answer, and I think the answer is just more choice and more variety and more opportunity. And it's a big shift for me on our farm has been, we used to kind of think, well, we want every paddock that we're moving our animals into to sort of have 75% grasses and some percentage of legumes, 20%, 5% forbs, this kind of notion. But I think about it now more as that it's actually better to have a lot of diversity in those percentages in different paddocks, and that throughout the course of, let's say, a week of grazing, that the animals encounter a lot of mixture and a lot of choice and a lot of options. And that as I craft pastures, as I think about silvopasture trees, I might want to be putting in the space that they might become a fodder source in the future. That, you know, again, it's not a uniform thing where I have 10 willows and 10 locusts in every paddock or something like that, but it's more of having some mixture and some variety and some uniqueness, right, to each part of the landscape. Does that resonate with what you're thinking about?
Absolutely does. And I'm thinking of, we used to teach a 2-week short course on this kind of stuff at Utah State University. Very hands-on, very, very hands-on with all working with animals and so forth. But we had a guy from Africa, from Namibia, come to that course years ago. And I wondered why he came, actually. I won't go into the details of that, but it was amazing. I went back to Namibia years later, and I mentioned this paper that I'm working with a guy in Botswana on right now. And he knew of what this guy, when he went back there, and he worked with many clients there that had livestock, and they totally changed the ways that they set up pastures. Rather than trying to have more uniformity within pastures, they started to fence in ways that created incredible diversity. And I heard these ranchers that were there talking about their experience working with this fellow. And yeah, very much relates to what you were saying. You know, give them lots of options. If you think about diversity, plants. Of course, nowadays soil is the buzzword, and obviously soil is healthy soil is so important. But I often think, it's plants and it's diversity of plants that turn dirt into soil and that turn soil into homes and communities. It's the plants that do that. Below ground for herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores, and above ground as well. And so when you have diversity, creating homes for so many creatures, and I think that's what ultimately becomes health in a landscape for wild creatures and domestic creatures as well.
That's great. That's a great great way to tie this bundle sort of together, right? We're kind of zooming in out from these specifics to this big picture piece. I wanted to share one experience we're having at our farm and get your thoughts on it, and I'll probably bug you later for more analysis of this. But we've been doing a simple fodder analysis of 6 species on our farm. Mm-hmm. We got a small grant to pay for the sampling because that's really the biggest cost is doing samples every 2 weeks, 8 to 10 times a year. As I'm sure you're aware as you get into this.
Get a lifetime of that. That's right. So, no, I do know. Go ahead.
But yeah, so let me actually, I'm going to share my screen for a second and just, I'll put the link for folks that are interested in this in the chat. And this is just preliminary after the first year. Oops. Hold on a second. Where's the one? There we go. So this is the report itself, and I just zoomed down to this middle section. You can see that there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of we just got these basic forage analyses for these 6 species. There's a bunch of tables in here with some of the average data, and then we looked a bit at the fluctuation of how these values changed over the course of the season. Because I'm really interested in these questions around like, well, when might be the optimal time from some perspective to feed a fodder, right, or make that available to them. Is there an optimal time, or is it sort of just let's just get a bunch of different things going there? And so so I just want to point out, I think it's really interesting and we chose 3 species that we are actively planting as part of silvopasture: the black locust, the poplar, and the willow. And then we chose 3 other species that I know people despise for various reasons in our landscape, and sort of say they don't have a place here, right? This sort of non-native or invasive species complex, and we could go on and on about our different feelings about that. But the point is, they're in the landscape, and the animals utilize them. And that was one thing I noticed: is they value them. They don't look at them and say, "I think that's a non-native species."
Right? Native or non-native. Same with the wildlife, actually.
Exactly. And yeah, no, that's true. And a lot of species, as we've, globally reduced the diversity of habitat, right? A lot of species have had to adapt to the habitats we're creating through our negligence, right?
Absolutely.
So when I notice my sheep devouring honeysuckle berries, you know, which some people tell me are toxic and others say, you know, this plant shouldn't be here. Regardless, it's there. And when we had a drought in 2016, we really relied on these woody species to get us through that period. So
Right.
all this to say, what I think is there's a lot of interesting ways to look at this data, but what I think is really interesting is that there's not one species that we looked at from any angle that is quote unquote superior, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's not one that's like the one to do. It's like I want all of these here because they all bring something different to the table, whether they're, you know, high in protein, whether they hold their leaves later in the season or they leaf out early in the season, whether they offer tannins or they offer, you know, these different macro or micro elements to the
Right.
animal. And so
Right.
the conclusion
Right.
is like, yes, please, let's have all of these and more. At least initially, that's my feeling. And so I just was curious
No.
if you had any, you know, if this is just building, you know, upon, we're looking at 6 species, right? But what are the ways that we could think about this when we look at different plants? And often what I find is I challenge myself not to assign value and say that this is good or this is bad. And I think that often plays out in landscapes, whether we're talking about invasive plants or with foresters I work with, you know, there's good trees and there's trash trees, this kind of thing. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that kind of
Right. No,
individual species
I
level
appreciate
stuff.
what you're
Yeah.
saying very much. And
Yeah.
you know, certainly there's a place in my heart for the native, what we would consider to be the native plant species and so forth. But when one looks at landscapes over any time period, I think of a book by a Canadian ecologist who's long retired now, maybe dead, E.C. Pelou. She was talking about after the Ice Age, the changes that have taken place in North America in a book she wrote. And it just so captured her. She spent her whole life studying vegetation. And, you know, what we think of as native is really, and I'm not meaning to, I appreciate that, but you know, these plants and animals are moving around the globe all the time. And she's looking over since the last glaciation, the last 10,000, 12,000 years. And it just strikes you so much how what we consider native, a lot of those species weren't here. Plants are moving around all the time as climates change. And so I've, I've, I very much appreciate the native species, but I think of it in a much more dynamic sense nowadays than I would have, say, 60 years ago.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great. So I
You know,
think,
and I've
yeah.
often thought what you were saying, you know, when you look at um, species that have invaded across landscapes and the wildlife species that utilize them, and I think the same thing that you had said, well, they don't discriminate them as native versus invasive. And um, you know, when you think of invasive, the Homo sapiens are probably the most invasive species on the planet,
Sure.
actually, huh?
Right. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, so then we consider other things
Yeah.
invasive. But no, I take, you know, and I take the point. You look at these different species that you've got, they're playing roles in the environment. You see those functional roles, they're adding to diversity. And so maybe who are we to judge in a sense about, you know, what's native and what's invasive? Diversity, I think, is what, for me anyway, makes so much sense, is how do you
Yeah.
maintain diversity of landscapes?
And certainly I think in our management, we're managing toward, toward native plants or plants that are found in this part of the world more traditionally. And yeah, there's conversations about how we draw those boundaries, but I'm certainly not hopefully scaring any local folks by saying, yeah, I'm out here propagating buckthorn or something like that. We don't need to, you know, encourage
Right.
it to produce, but I actually see it as, all right, well, instead of trying to remove it wholesale, I'm going to pullard it or coppice it and actually use it as a feed source, but the animals help keep it in check. Because one of the reasons these plants have become such a force on the landscape is because they haven't had some of that natural check from the, and I think back to your blackbrush, it seems like that animal interaction is partially a check on some of the effects of that plant on the landscape. So I'm not going to actively go out and plant these things, but I can certainly work with them as a valuable member of the larger ecosystem, I think is the way to
Right. What I think about a lot when I think about native species too, or this would apply to invasives that are able to come in, is that they're able to utilize the landscapes without any kind of external inputs. That's where home is for them. And the value of that, I think, is tremendous. I often think of that, especially out here in the arid West, in relation to all the lawns that we spend so much money on in terms of fertilizer, mowing, gasoline, water, huge amounts of water. And I think, if we would change what we see as beautiful away from a monoculture of Kentucky bluegrass to native plant species and the way they come and go in the landscape from the spring to the fall to the summer, we would save a tremendous amount of resource, but also come to appreciate the value of native plants in our own environment. And beyond that, each one tried to become a little farmer in a sense of, nurturing native plants, growing vegetable, herbal, medicinal gardens, and so forth, as a part of what we do as a culture.
Yeah, and I think of that too. One of my forestry mentors talks about that in the context of cutting trees in the forest, because he says if we all appreciated and valued more the deformities and the lack of straightness and these qualities of the wood that needs to be taken out of the forest in order to help the biggest, best trees grow, it would be a whole flip in terms of the way the woods was managed. From, we're always taking out the best, fastest growing and straightest and cleanest wood.
Yes.
Is that what the culture assigns value to. And there's a little bit of interest in the kind of funky stuff, right? But it's not what drives the forestry industry. And if we just were to say, I really like this abnormality, that actually would, change the way the forest is managed. That's an interesting, that concept of value and how we place value, I think, is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What we see as valuable and beautiful and so forth.
Great. So I'd love to, we got to wrap up here, but I'd love to just, if you could share this behave.net website with folks and just some of the things they can follow up on, and then maybe a little bit about the nourishment book as well, just to kind of, because this is certainly a conversation that was only going to begin today. We think we covered a lot of ground, but I want to, connect folks to more information, more ways to dig into this. So can you talk about the website first?
Yes. During the last 10 years that I was at Utah State University, from 2000 till 2010, we were fortunate to get a large grant, about a $4.5 million grant, to take the kind of things that we'd been studying for the 25 years prior to that, and to really get that information out to people and across the country and across the world. And so the main focus was outreach. And we did that through websites like this Behave website. We had people like Beth Burritt and Kathy Voth. Many people know Kathy through the work she's done on training animals to be weed eaters and so forth. Beth and Kathy did a yeoman's work on putting together outreach materials of all sorts, from fact sheets to videos to this website. And so this website was a way to try to capture that. Beth has kept that going. I've been retired 11 years now. Beth's kept that website going, even though the Behave program is done. Let me say a word about the Behave program. For me, it was 10 incredibly stimulating years, and the reason was that we were working with people like would be here on the webinar, with farmers, with ranchers across the country, to take the principles and the processes and to think about how they could be best used by A.G. Smith and the Cottonwood Ranch in Nevada, Rick Danver and Bill Hopkin on Deseret Land and Livestock, Pete Farrell in Kansas, dairy farmers in New York. we worked with such a broad range of people. And the beauty was, the research was, it was a relationship between, we were all students. That's what I thought. We're all students trying to understand behavioral principles and processes and then put them into practice in ways that help to better people economically, help to better landscapes ecologically, help to better the social framework. And that was really it was a wonderful program that we were all involved with, and it was so neat. We were all learning so much, and not only were we working with domestic animals, we were working with wild animals as well, from elk and bison to birds to. Um, so I was sad to leave that. It was time to go, and it's. But to me, the beauty was it was no longer. It wasn't ivory tower. We're going to just do the research, publish it in the journals, and so forth. It's how do we take these ideas and put them into practice? How do we work with people to do this in ways that cut costs and on and on and on? And so this website back in the day was really about all of that. I know Beth's work to keep that going to some extent, but that's that's some background then on that Behave program, what it was about, and this website that came out of that.
Great, great. And yeah, if people browse through, there's a lot of ways to access different facets of the work and kind of explore. And I think everything has a lot of lessons to take onto the farm. And then just a quick note about your book would be great. This is relatively recent, but I know it's been a life or a very long-term project for you.
Yes, well, the book Nourishment, I retired 11 years ago. My wife and I moved from Logan, Utah to the backwoods of Colorado. Literally, we were 12 miles in on graveled road, living at 9,500 feet elevation in the transition zone between aspen and conifer and these big parklands, South Park. And it was a great, we went to the forest, basically. If you're familiar with the Hindu notions of the different stages of life, that was the stage to go to the forest and kind of prepare for the last years. But it was wonderful. It was like being a child again, actually, to go there and be surrounded by this diverse mix of different plant species. So beautiful, all the different species. And every kind of wild creature I was thinking this morning, from black bears all over the place, coyotes, coyote wolf crosses, bobcats, lynx, mountain lions, all the suites of different herbivores, badgers, you name it. It was amazing to be able to, and my wife and I would look at each other all the time and say, this is a stolen moment. We knew it was a stolen moment there. And it wouldn't work for everybody to be all alone up there clearing the backwoods, but for us, it was perfect. And so it was a chance. I thought about whether to write or not, and it was a chance to sit and reflect. The book is just quite reflective, at least I think. It's a chance to reflect on a visit to this planet and how amazingly beautiful it is. In the daytime, all these beautiful creatures, at the nighttime looking at that sky and to realize the Milky Way, 100 billion stars. And then there's 100 to 200 billion galaxies. It was a great time to, reflections on feeding body and spirit in a world of change is kind of it. So very briefly, there are 5 sections to the book. The first 3 or 4 sections really have to do with the materials like we've been talking about, and thinking about that in relation not only to domestic and wild animals, but to human food selection, nutrition, and health. The last 2 sections of the book, grappling with uncertainty and fading into mystery, are really, really about thinking, what is it possible to know during our brief visit to this planet, and the kind of the mystery and wonder of the whole deal. So, you pulling it all up nicely. So I actually haven't even looked at the book since we did the the final edit on it, and I find sometimes I've forgotten a little bit what, what all was in the book, between old memories and, you know, who knows what else.
I can relate to that, because sometimes folks will bring up, oh, you said this in the book, and I'm like, I did? I don't remember.
Exactly.
Okay,
was
I trust
wondering.
You've read it more recently than I have, but because these printed things are sort of a placeholder in time, but certainly I've learned a lot and continue to learn a lot, and it's I'm sure things I've said and written are different than what I know now. So, and that's life,
Right,
right?
you don't
So
want to become wed to any of it.
yeah, yeah. So Fred, thank you so much. It was really wonderful to chat with you and have you share these different aspects of just this fascinating thing that, like I said at the outset, was just such a huge discovery and continues to be something that I see the more I pay attention to the landscape. I'm getting this feedback and this information, and it's really reoriented us to center our grazing around our animals and their feedback they give us as they get feedback from the plants they eat. So thank you so much for opening me
Well,
to that, and hopefully the folks here have really valued that as well in this class.
well, Steve, thank you for the opportunity to be here with you. And I so appreciate the work that you're doing. You know, all these issues related to human food selection, nutrition, and health, and all the debate over what we should and shouldn't be eating, and ways with changing climates and all that. And silvopasture is such a huge and important facet of all of that, and ways to create human and environmental health. So I appreciate what you're doing, and really happy to be able to be on here with you.
Great, thanks. And we'll make sure to, I'll follow up if there's questions that come up and you all ask, or if you're on the recording version of this and you want to ask a question, I can forward that to Fred, and I'm sure he's happy to give his thoughts on those things. But for now, what we're going to do, great, thanks, Fred. Yeah, for now, what we're going to do is just take a quick minute break. I got a song that's 1:40. We're just going to take that quick break, and then we'll be back, and I'll wrap up the class with just a short introduction to the Google Earth or mapping exercise for the week. So in the meantime, do give your thanks to Fred in the chat, and we'll be back just in a minute here.